Hey guys, Whiskey Emerson here. I hope you guys are doing great. So, funny story. Before we start the first YouTube video for Legacy, the Artist Behind the Legends, for Season 2, Episode 1 with F Scott Fitzgerald, I just have a funny story I have to share, and that is that while I initially recorded the entire episode, my computer immediately shut down the minute I was done, lost all of it. Yay! So we're gonna do a round 2 right now, which means I'm not only a little buzzed, but I'm very warmed up. So I think this is gonna be great. I'm trying to be positive, even though I was a little miffed. But anyway, super excited to start recording right now. I'm about to hit the record with this and we will get started. But thanks so much for being here with me on YouTube. And, I hope this is just a fun avenue where if you like listening to podcasts and you'd rather be watching me talk, I mean, some people do like that. They throw me on in the background while you have friends over and you just get to see me drinking my Fitzgerald, the drink of the week, throwing my hands around like this. I will do this the entire time and doing a lot of this. Hopefully I don't knock anything over. That happens sometimes. But anyway, I love you guys. I'm so grateful to have you here. Thanks for being on this ride with me. It makes it so much fun. I'm just happy to have you be a part of it. So anyway, let's get started with episode 1 of season 2. All right, hold on. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, known to most of us as F Scott Fitzgerald, was an American writer active during the 1920s and 1930s, whose more popular literary works were a reflection of the Jazz Age. If you're drawing a blank, he's the author of the American classic, The Great Gatsby, novel I'm quite certain is required reading in every high school across the United States. He achieved success and celebrity at a very young age upon the publication of his first novel, This Side of Paradise. And after winning the heart of his muse, he went on to live a parallel existence to that of his novel's characters, a life of swimming in fountains, drinking champagne until dawn, and becoming one of the most coveted party guests during the Fitzgerald's residency in both New York City and in Paris and on the French Riviera. But as we all know, you can't live on top forever. And soon F. Scott and Zelda found that their large living lifestyle on the Riviera and in Paris and in New York took its toll. Fitzgerald turned to alcohol and Zelda, well, she sort of lost it. And later, she discovered that her mental status really had never exactly been healthy to begin with. The return to America was littered with tragic circumstances, and F. Scott struggled to find his literary voice with the end of the Roaring Twenties and the start of the Great Depression. Phew! This week starts out like a shooting star, and it fades to black fast. And I hope you're ready for it. I'm so looking forward to it. I mean, who is ready to kick off Season 2 of Legacy, the Artist Behind the Legends? This girl is. I'm Whiskey Emerson, and you're listening to Legacy. Happy Friday, and welcome back, everybody. Yes, it's been a great few weeks. I traveled around and did some book signings. Oh, by the way, this is Whiskey Emerson, your lovely, crass, and just all-around bright, shining host who loves to be here with you every Friday, drinking and talking about deceased writers. So, like I said, I have been around doing some book signings. I was in Vegas, LA, back in Portland. We'll talk about that soon. But aside from that, I toured the country of Jordan, which was an incredible once-in-a-lifetime experience. I just got back from exploring the Grand Canyon with one of my best friends, and I'm finally back to Portland, and summer weather is finally here. I could not be more thrilled. We had a brutal winter this year. Lots of rain, lots of gray skies, and after a while, it just takes a toll on you. I could not be happier to be having sunshine right now. But anyway, little homework, before we get into the podcast starting back up. I have a signing here in Portland on Saturday, May 12th from 1 to 3 p.m. at the Beaverton location of the Barnes & Noble store, just outside of Portland, 10-minute drive, not far. But anyway, for all my Portlandians, or for anyone in the general area, if you guys want to come out, support me, you can buy a copy. I'll sign it for you of my novel, West of Hell, also available on Amazon.com. I also if you love the podcast, want to come out and just meet me, please come out. I would love to meet you guys. You are the best, and I just love having your support. Now, speaking of support, I've recently started a Patreon page to back up the podcast a little bit, and that is at www.patreon.com/legacypodcast. And if you guys aren't really sure what Patreon is, or if you're kind of like, what is she talking about? This is so weird. I don't understand. Basically, it's just for patrons who want to support the podcast. So if you guys love listening to this every week, go check it out. You can also find the links to all of that on the podcast page, www.legacywithwhiskey.com. Also on my page, www.whiskyemerson.com. Whew, lots of homework. Anyway, so shout out also to my first patrons. Love you guys so much. So grateful for you. I appreciate the support on a level you don't even understand. First up, Dharma Tam. Second, Richard Sachs. Aaron Dan, Cameron Christophers, and Anthony Klein. You guys fucking rock. Thank you so much. It means so much to me, and I could not be more thrilled to have people backing the podcast already. So, drink of the week. Also, just an FYI for my listeners and people viewing me on YouTube right now. If you would like to become a patron for the podcast, one of the benefits is that if you donate every month, it's basically kind of like a monthly subscription, you will get a live video of the cocktail demonstration and recipe done by yours truly, which is always a lot of fun, and also just more time you get to spend with me, and we all know you love spending time with me. So, the drink of the week, very fittingly, is the Fitzgerald. Now, a Fitzgerald is actually one of my favorite summer cocktails. It's light and refreshing, gin-based. We all know I hate vodka. And it's just one of those cocktails that is sweet and satisfying, but not to a point that it's going to overkill your taste buds. So, ingredients: 2 ounces of gin. I use 3, but whatever. 1 ounce of lemon juice, 3/4 of an ounce of simple syrup, and 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. All you do, toss all those ingredients into a shaker with ice, shake, 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 strain into a whiskey glass over ice, and garnish with a lemon. Bam! You got your drink right there. Also, if you are a West of Hell fan, you can use your West of Hell whiskey glass that you probably have sitting in your cabinet, which I am doing right now. Anyway, now that all that is taken care of, let's talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Best known works. Of course, number 1 on the list, The Great Gatsby. We all know that, very aware of that. Next up, you have The Beautiful and the Damned, Tender is the Night, This Side of Paradise, and his 5th novel that was technically unfinished before he died, The Last Tycoon. We'll talk more about that later on in the podcast. So, now that we have all that homework out of the way and caught my breath a little bit here, let's dive into this timeline of F. Scott Fitzgerald's life. So F. Scott was born on September 24th of 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, to parents Edward Fitzgerald and Mary, or Molly, McCullen Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was named after his second cousin, 3 times removed, a man by the name of Francis Scott Key, who, if you are unaware, is actually the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. A fun fact here, something I think is kind of weird, but comes up. So, apparently F. Scott was also related to Mary Surratt, like a double great aunt or something. I don't know. And Mary Surratt was actually the only woman out of a group of, I think, 4 or 5 people who was hanged as a conspirator behind the assassination of President Lincoln in 1865. And one of the reasons that she was actually a victim of this is because it was the inn that she owned where the conspiracy plotting took place, I guess I should say. So she was thrown in as a conspirator and unfortunately died as a result. Whether or not she was actually involved, we don't know. Anyway, complete sidebar, but we're back on track now. So F. Scott was an only child, sadly having lost both of his sisters before he was even born. Now, Edward Fitzgerald, F. Scott's father, was described as a quiet, gentlemanly man with beautiful southern manners. who originally operated and worked as a wicker furniture salesman in Buffalo, New York, until the business failed. Oh, awful. So Edward joined on with Procter & Gamble until he was fired in 1908, no reason specified. And then he moved his family back to St. Paul, Minnesota. Molly, F. Scott's mother, was the daughter of an Irish immigrant who had made a fucking fortune in wholesale grocery of all the businesses. So funny to me. And as a result, Molly's inheritance was at times the only thing that kept the Fitzgerald family afloat. As well as Molly had kind of like a random aunt who would throw cash at them whenever she asked for it. But anyway, so those two things basically, once they got to St. Paul, were the only thing that kept the family rolling. Now, F. Scott had a very comfortable upper middle class upbringing in spite of money troubles along the way. So in Buffalo and in St. Paul, Fitzgerald attended private Catholic schools, did that myself. Anyway, well, that's for another time. But he also demonstrated at a very young age that he had a vast intellect with a particular interest in literature and writing. Now, I must say, his parents certainly had a strange arrangement for his early education, at least when he was in Buffalo. So he could actually pick. So this is the deal. I guess he only had to be at school for half the day and he could pick which half, which I don't know much about parenting. I don't have children, but you should not be letting your 11-year-old dictate when they get to go to school. I feel like that's never a good idea. Probably a tad spoiled if you ask me, but anyway, what the fuck. So once in St. Paul, this certainly changed. At age 13, F. Scott had his first piece of writing put into the school paper, and the publication of this detective story seems to have really fueled F. Scott's interest in becoming an author. He went on to enroll in the prestigious Newman School, a prep school in New Jersey, where he played football and excelled in his schoolwork, and he loved his life at Newman. He had a great time, got along well with his schoolmates, loved playing football, and more than anything, he just really started to realize, with the encouragement of a lot of his teachers, just how much he loved literature and also how much he was interested in becoming a writer of all things. So, upon graduating from Newman, Fitzgerald attended Princeton University with the expectation to pursue his literary ambitions and firmly dedicated himself to becoming a writer. He wrote for the Princeton Triangle Club, the Nassau Lit, and the Princeton Tiger. I don't know why I went British there. I just felt like it was necessary. He additionally was involved in numerous university clubs, writing clubs, drama clubs, a couple other things like that. And sadly, though, F. Scott only really focused on his writing, and he ignored his other coursework. And this forced him into academic probation due to bad grades, I believe in 1917, that kind of like that spring. So he basically went on academic probation and then kind of had the summer. And they basically were giving him the summer, I think, to kind of think it over and get his shit together, which we'll talk more about that in a moment. But anyway, so, oh, hold up. Oh, sorry, guys. Had a little phone buzz incident. Anyway, so while at Princeton, F. Scott met Chicago socialite and debutante Ginevra King while on a visit at home in St. Paul. So while he was at Princeton, but not physically at Princeton, if that makes sense. Anyway, he fell madly in love with her. Absolutely head over heels, wrote her letters every day, almost on a creepy level. But sadly, around the time of his probation, this romance started to fizzle. I think just because he was struggling emotionally with probation, etc., etc. And so King actually became the inspiration down the road for the characters of Isabelle Bourge on This Side of Paradise and Daisy in The Great Gatsby, which, if you know anything about either of those novels, they are these big socialite, very, very wealthy women who are beautiful and seem like there's so much underneath the surface than you realize. And so it's just very interesting to find that she is the inspiration behind these two women. So by that fall of 1917, after a vain attempt to rejoin his class, Fitzgerald dropped out of Princeton altogether and enlisted in the Army. And I do want to note here, so one of the things that was a huge issue for Fitzgerald, and one of the reasons he left school in general, was because of the fact that when he got to school that fall, sadly, he had gone into his senior year, I think, with the expectation that he was going to be the head of a couple of clubs, really, kind of take over one or two of the the literary magazines for Princeton. And because he had been on academic probation, they wouldn't allow him to do any of that. And so he was kind of devastated. In the winter of 1917, Fitzgerald was stationed at Fort Leavenworth, where he became increasingly paranoid that he might die in the war, which is World War I, by the way, that he might die in the war before his literary dreams were fulfilled. In haste, F. Scott put together a novel he titled The Romantic Egoist. And this was in the weeks prior to reporting for duty. Scribner's, I wrote Scribner's, was the publisher he submitted the manuscript to, and they rejected the book, yet the reviewer encouraged F. Scott to submit more work down the road, and this was something Fitzgerald definitely did not forget. He put it in the back of his mind, and I think it was essentially a beacon of hope for him during the next couple of years of just kind of tumult he dealt with, trying to figure out if he could become a writer or not. F. Scott was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry of the Army and assigned to Camp Sheridan outside of Montgomery, Alabama. Alabama! What's up, y'all? Sorry, I did not mean that in a pandering way at all. I just love doing a Southern accent. I don't know why. It must be my Missouri blood. But anyway, it was there that Fitzgerald met Zelda Sayre, the daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court justice, and he immediately fell in love with her. Zelda was described as the golden girl of Montgomery society. Golden girl was pretty much how Fitzgerald wrote her later on, or at least described her in his own writing later on. And Zelda was beloved by many, with more suitors than she knew what to do with. Hell yeah, girl. Zelda was both unconventional for their time and quite bold, noted for being fond of reckless enterprises, like appearing in a flesh-colored bathing suit as a joke. This is not something anybody would really do during that time. It was scandalous. But this is something that Fitzgerald did not forget, and he actually used this later in Tender as the Night. Smart man. So when the war ended in 1918, Fitzgerald was thrilled not to be deployed. And after informally, so kind of without her family's permission, because her family was not exactly keen on F. Scott, but informally, F. Scott convinced Zelda to accept his marriage proposal. And then he set off for New York City to prove to Zelda that he could financially support the two of them. Now, F. Scott worked his ass off for the Baron Collier advertising agency, but after failing to get his short stories published and barely making enough money to get by, Zelda cut off the engagement. Sucks. Ooh. So Fitzgerald went on a bender, as we can probably all imagine. I know I would. And then he returned home to St. Paul, where he heavily revised The Romantic Egoist and renamed it This Side of Paradise. So during this time, F. Scott was short on money, and weirdly enough, of all things, he took a job repairing car rooftops. So random, but I totally get it. With his fingers crossed, Fitzgerald sent his rewrite back to Scribner's, whatever the fuck it is, in the fall of 1919, and they loved it. The book was published on March 26th of 1920, just a couple months later the next year, sold over 40,000 copies in the first year alone, and that was a huge number for back then, by the way. And about a week before the book's publication, F. Scott and Zelda actually got married. They had rekindled their romance and gotten engaged once again. No one really knows an exact time frame, but my theory is that Zelda was able to convince her parents that, look, F. Scott got this book deal. He's gonna be somebody. Let me just marry this SOB because I love him and it's all I want to do. And so I think she was probably able to pitch that to her parents quite well. Now, the pair would have one daughter, Frances Scott, or Scotty Fitzgerald, born on October 26, 1921, about 18 months later. And It's actually rumored that Zelda was pregnant again in 1922 and had an abortion, but there's no actual evidence of the abortion that can be found in written record. F. Scott does actually write about abortion in a very kind of passive way in The Beautiful and the Damned. And he basically kind of mentions that a woman has a pregnancy that got taken care of, but we all know what that means, essentially. So, moving on. New York, the Roaring Twenties. Bathtub gin and flaming youth. That is all you need to know. Also, flapper dresses and short hair. So basically, the Fitzgeralds were known for their wild partying, making themselves into the icons of the jazz age. Everyone wanted to meet F. Scott. He was this hugely successful author, and he just had this gorgeous knockout Southern wife who loved to drink and stay out all night partying. So, of course, I mean, they were both known to have a good time, even if it meant getting kicked out of both the Biltmore and the Commodore hotels for their drunkenness. We all got to do something. So, after the birth of their daughter, they moved to Long Island, where their extravagant social life continued to be wild and riotous, but Fitzgerald kept working to attempt to stay out of debt. And it's so fascinating because we'll get into this a little more once they move across the pond to Europe, but F. Scott started to realize that he couldn't just live off of the royalties of his novels. They were living this lifestyle where they were spending more than they were earning. And when you have a lifestyle like that, you got to supplement. And so one of the things that F. Scott did is he started writing short stories while they were in New York and kind of got in with a couple of magazines and made some extra cash that way, just to be able to try and, supplement the income a little bit more. And sure enough, it worked. So around 1924, F. Scott and his family ventured to Paris and to the French Riviera, a place where so many American artists and writers were flocking to in those days. We talk about this in the Hemingway episode a little bit, but it's where the Lost Generation was. It's where Gertrude Stein was, It was where all these big name people and all these incredible, just talented people lived at the same time. It's just unbelievable. And I have mentioned this before in the Hemingway podcast, but there's a great movie called Midnight in Paris by Woody Allen directs it, and it basically shows Paris in the 1920s and the people that were there, and God, it's just amazing. I mean, as someone who's a literary nerd and especially loves Hemingway and F. Scott and just all the writers and artists of that generation, Gertrude Stein. Oh, what a badass woman, by the way. Anyway, I would just kill to be Owen Wilson in that movie going back. Minus the whole, tuberculosis thing, but, if you're just going back for a day, I feel like getting TB would probably be pretty hard. Who knows? Anyway, sorry, sidetrack. So Fitzgerald became fast friends with many in Paris, including Ernest Hemingway, who, Hemingway loved F. Scott quite a bit, but he thought Zelda was nothing more than a parasite, jealous of Fitzgerald's talent. And honestly, if it's Hemingway, he's a pretty damn good read on people as far as I'm concerned. So I know it sounds terrible, but I'm going to have to side with Hemingway here, guys. So because the Fitzgeralds lived so large, F. Scott, like I mentioned previously, had to find ways to increase his income by writing short stories for magazines like Esquire, Collier's Weekly, and the Saturday Evening Post. And F. Scott hated doing this. Hated it. He wanted more than anything just to keep writing novels. That was his bread and butter. And he and Hemingway both referred to this as whoring out their talents. To be fair, I get it, but Scott was very good at it. He would make great money doing this, and it was able to sustain a lifestyle literally of staying out all night drinking, eating out all the time, living in hotels. Clearly he was a very, very talented individual. So, in spite of the rave critical reviews, the release of Gatsby did not have the effect F. Scott so desired on his audience. Nowadays, it's considered his masterpiece, of course, right? But back then, he was just finding it increasingly more difficult to sell novels of all, you would never think that. But in 1927, they ended up moving on to Hollywood, where Fitzgerald was invited to write a flapper comedy for United Artists, basically a movie company out there, or film company out there, I guess I should say. And F. Scott soon met and began an affair with Lois Moran, and she became a temporary muse for Fitzgerald, inspiring him to actually rewrite the character of Rosemary Hoyt, one of the central characters in Tender is the Night, his latest novel. And Tender is the Night is a novel that took him 4 to 5 years to really put together. It was a passion project for him in between. Also, as you can probably imagine, the marital issues that Zelda and F. Scott were starting to have were just getting out of control. They were really having a hard time together, and the constant boozing, the constant being out till all hours of the night really did not help with that. Now, after only 2 months, they left California. Zelda became more and more emotionally unstable, and sadly was given a diagnosis of schizophrenia in 1930 after collapsing pretty much during a fit, but also due to exhaustive work on her ballet, which we'll talk about in a minute. In 1932, unable to personally care for her any longer, just because Zelda would have violent outbursts and she was constantly just kind of in mental distress, which when you're constantly in distress and having anxiety attacks, I can't imagine that's easy to handle as a spouse. So F. Scott had Zelda placed at the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, one of the best, by the way. And for the rest of her life, Zelda would be in sanatoriums. With the decline of Zelda's health, and after a decade of a roller coaster marriage, F. Scott found his train was just coming off the rails, and shit was just not great. It really wasn't. So, to be fair, Zelda was not without her own array of talents, but she could never counter the uselessness and dissatisfaction she felt living in F. Scott's shadow. So this girl who had once been the center of attention was no longer the chosen one. And that was a concept that Zelda had a difficult time accepting. She picked up hobbies like painting. Painting was something she actually did, especially watercolors, for the rest of her life. She tried writing, but she could never be as good as Scott. And so because of that, she was like almost bittered by it. And then there was ballet. So when Zelda was young, she was a very talented dancer. And unfortunately, she started ballet well into her 20s and realized it was all to no avail. No matter how hard she worked, she was never going to be a prima. She was never going to be that great. And her dedication to dance just ate away at her. And the realization that she was never going to be that great at it is what many people think catalyzed her serious breakdown in 1930. I think it's interesting because F. Scott definitely doesn't hesitate in his later years to say that he firmly thinks that Zelda is one of the many causes of the issues he had with alcohol and just also with the kind of like just claws that were holding his career back. And he thinks a lot of that has to do with the fact that he had to take care of her and also because she was so hard to deal with. And anytime he would try and write and work on his novel, she would guilt trip him about not spending time with her, not doing this, not doing that. She was always pushing him to do anything but right. And as Scott reflected on that when he got older, I think one of the things he realized is just that perhaps Hemingway had been right. Maybe she was a toxic influence, right? Maybe she was a part of the problem. Now, unless you are in a relationship, I don't think you can make the judgment call there. But I will say this from my own personal opinion. I think along with the pairing of mental illness and spoiled brat syndrome, I cannot imagine what dealing with Zelda Fitzgerald must have been like. I'm sure it was very difficult. So in a strange way, this disintegration of the Fitzgeralds, who were once the poster children of the jazz age, kind of faded with this brutal swing into the Great Depression. Oh yeah, don't forget about the goddamn Great Depression because that hit right in the 30s. And all of a sudden, this decade of excess and bright youth and champagne, it was no longer coveted by Americans. Nobody was able to live up to that hype anymore. Everyone was struggling. I mean, nobody had money. It was just an awful, awful time. So financially stricken with a lack of book sales and Zelda's medical bills, F. Scott took a writing deal with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in 1937, and this deal moved him out to Hollywood once again. And finally, he was able to earn a sustainable income. Kudos, my friend. Fitzgerald also began a high-profile love affair with movie columnist Sheila Graham, who he lived with for the rest of his life in California. Now, this was a high-profile relationship because of the fact that everyone knew Zelda was pretty much not getting out of mental health care. She was very schizophrenic, noted for having conversations with people that did not exist. And a lot of people looked at F. Scott kind of as this tortured soul who was stuck. And so because of that, it was just kind of accepted. They would go to movie premieres together, they would go to all sorts of events together, and no one batted an eyelash. It was just how it was. So during this time, F. Scott commenced working on his final novel, The Last Tycoon. He originally titled it The Love of the Last Tycoon, but this was a novel he would never finish. So for the last year of his life, Fitzgerald actually no longer worked with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He wrote a series of short stories called the Pat Hobby Stories, wherein he mocked himself as a Hollywood hack, and they became widely popular, and they were published in Esquire from 1940 to 1941, of all things. And so he was kind of riding on this like weird, he was gaining more notoriety again. He was working on this last novel. I think a part of him probably felt that maybe he'd relit that spark. Occasionally, he would travel east to visit Zelda and also his daughter Scotty throughout these years. She entered Vassar College in 1938, but his time with Zelda was typically pretty painful. And there was one incident which is just really weird. I don't know what the hell went on here, but there was one incident in 1938 where F. Scott and Sheila Graham got into a horrible, violent, drunk fight, apparently. This is just, what I'm guessing. And and he left California to visit Zelda at her hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. Now, weirdly enough, there were a whole group of patients that were going on a trip, and Zelda missed it, and they were all going to Cuba. Now, if you don't know anything about Cuba during this time, Cuba was like the resort island for Americans. Like, everybody would go all the time and visit and stay. I mean, Hemingway had a place there for God knows how many years. So F. Scott chose to take Zelda on this trip, and it proved to be a fucking disaster. Fitzgerald got badly beaten up trying to stop a cockfight. What the hell? Why would you do that? Oh, so dumb. Anyway. And then he returned with Zelda to the U.S., so drunk and exhausted, he himself had to be hospitalized. So after leaving Zelda in Asheville, the two never saw each other again. And F. Scott returned to his life and to Graham in California, who took him back. And, it sounds crazy, but I look at an incident like that and I think of that as one man's last hope that maybe there's something left. Maybe this woman he's weirdly loved and attached to isn't the worst person in the world. Maybe they do love each other. Maybe he can give her something. Maybe there is some guilt that he feels for her not being able to live a full life. And it just backfires on him. And, oh man. It just shows how terrible of a thing mental illness is. Not just for the person who suffers from it, because it's a terrible, terrible burden to deal with, but it also is so hard as a bystander, So on December 21st of 1940, F. Scott suffered a heart attack, the second of the year, and it proved to be a fatal one. So at age 44, we lost F. Scott Fitzgerald. His fifth and last novel, The Last Tycoon, was finished by an old friend named Edmund Wilson, who basically just used F. Scott's detailed notes, outlines, and personal writings to complete the story for him. And what's so awful, it just would breaks my fucking heart is the fact that Fitzgerald died believing himself to be a failure. And if only he could see how wrong he was. Now, if only he could see how beloved his works are amongst the literary community, just among people in general. Why would they have made so many damn Gatsby movies if it wasn't incredibly well done? Oh. So before I get to my conclusion here, I want to share this with you guys. This is kind of an impromptu thing, but I have this article I found, and it's actually an interview done by a man named Michael Mock. It was first published in the New York Post on September 25th of 1936, and it is a first-hand interview with F. Scott. And let me just say how tough it was to read this. It was very, very tough. And the first thing I want to dive into here is F. Scott describes himself as a cracked plate. And a cracked plate mainly because he can still be used from time to time, but essentially he's broken. And this is a quote from him. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, the cure doesn't work. And in a real dark night of the soul, it is always 3 o'clock in the morning, day after day. At that hour, the tendency is to refuse to face things as long as possible by retiring into an infantile dream. But one is continually startled out of this by various contacts with the world. Jesus. You realize what type of a mental, depressive state you have to be in to constantly feel that type of regression. It's just awful. So this is another thing he says, and this really struck me. He says, a writer like me must have an utter confidence, an utter faith in his star. It's an almost mystical feeling, a feeling of nothing can happen to me, nothing can harm me, nothing can touch me. Thomas Wolfe has it, Ernest Hemingway has it. I once had it. But through a series of blows, many of them my own fault, something happened to that sense of immunity, and I lost my grip. Oh, good God. It's just so awful. And when you think about those two things put together, let's draw it back in for this grand finale. So, towards the end of the interview, the reporter asked him how he felt now about the jazz-mad, gin-mad generation whose feverish doings he chronicled in This Side of Paradise. How had they done? How did they stand up to the world? Fitzgerald says, why should I bother myself about them? Haven't I enough worries of my own? You know as well as I do what has happened to them. Some became brokers and threw themselves out of windows. Others became bankers and shot themselves. Still, others became newspaper reporters, and few became successful authors. His face twitched. Successful authors, he cried. Oh my God, successful authors. Oh, thank God for this cocktail. Conclusion. Sadly, F. Scott Fitzgerald had the good fortune and the misfortune of being a writer who perfectly summed up an era. It is amazing to see the parallels between F. Scott's own life with that of his novels' characters, and that somewhat dark and pessimistic undertone of how, at times, success is more of a curse than a blessing. Still, in his very next breath, Fitzgerald would convey an almost innocent sense of hope in the future, giving an odd balance between reality and our dreams. He had an intensely romantic imagination, which he once described as having a, quote, heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, end quote. More than anything, Fitzgerald wanted to try and create his dream of the promises of American life, and of the man who could realize and capture them. And unfortunately for F Scott Fitzgerald, he was unable to do that with his own life. Cheers to you, F Scott. I have loved your work since I was very young. You've created stories that have reflected a generation of people and that have taught us so many valuable lessons. And I'm only sorry that you were not given another chance to give us more. Or that, better yet, you weren't able to find peace in your own life. Cheers, my friend. So, let's climb out of the darkness a little, shall we? Whiskey's recommendations. Of course, Gatsby. Read Gatsby. If you haven't read Gatsby, read Gatsby. It's a short read. You can do it on a Saturday by the fire, outside on your porch, drinking a cocktail. Just do it, please. Pop culture references. Gatsby movies. 1926, 1949, 1974, 2000, and 2013. All different versions of The Great Gatsby. I will say my favorite, because I love Leonardo DiCaprio, is the 2013 one. Also, I love it because Baz Luhrmann just does it right. You know, he throws the jazz age into this just giant, exorbitant, extravagant display, and that is all it was. It was just a party, and it was all superficial bullshit, and it's wonderfully done. I highly recommend it. Great soundtrack as well. So anyway, that's my pop culture reference. Also, of course, like I previously mentioned, Midnight in Paris, you have Tom Hiddleston playing F. Scott Fitzgerald, and God, he's so great. Also Hemingway, and that is amazing. But Tom Hiddleston is just dreamy, and you know, to be honest, F. Scott was pretty dreamy too, so they kind of go hand in hand together. So anyway, next week, oh boy. So episode 2, we are going a completely different direction, and the podcast will be covering the life of the infamous Charles Bukowski. That's right. So Bukowski was a German-American poet, short story writer, and novelist active beginning in the early 1940s and up until his death in the 1990s. Now, Bukowski is definitely one of those writers who does not give a shit about political correctness. And a lot of his work centers around his hometown of LA and just kind of the nitty-gritty LA, not the glamorized version of it. So we'll read a few excerpts next week just to give you some perspective, but the life this guy lived definitely reflects in his writing, and categorically speaking, he was an active participant in the dirty fiction and transgressive fiction movements. I have been getting bugged for weeks by my husband, by a couple of buddies, all men, who all want me to cover Bukowski, so I'm giving in to the pressure here and doing it, but I promise, whatever drink of the week we have next week, it will be a strong one because we're going to need it. This guy lived a life, and it's going to be a big episode, and one of the reasons it'll be a big episode, like we talked about before, is because he lives so close to right now. So, anyway, I hope everybody has a kick-ass weekend. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it's so hard to cover a writer like F. Scott because I love his writing so much, and I know how awfully tragic his life story is, and it's very tough sometimes to get through a life story like this one because you want a happy ending. We are programmed to want happy endings, and when you don't get one, it hurts, especially for someone you feel like deserves it. So I hope everybody learned something new this week. At least had fun learning about, you know, just the historical aspect of what the Roaring Twenties were. And also just that, you know, you can't live a life like that and not have consequences, as bad as it sounds. But anyway, everyone have a great weekend. Don't think about the consequences. Have some drinks. Get outside. Enjoy yourselves. I'll be back next week with Mr. Charles Bukowski, and I'll see you guys then. Cheers. Well, guys, that's a wrap for round 1. Whoa. Been out of shape after that one. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this YouTube episode. I mean, I've never done this before, so we'll see how it goes. I hope everybody enjoys it. I'm going to piece them together. There's a couple cuts just because we had some weird stuff going on with recording, as you can probably imagine. This is round 1. There is going to be bloopers. But anyway, I love you guys so much. Thanks for being here with me. A big cheers, and I'll see you next week with Charles Bukowski.